I'm going to start today with one specific verse and one half of a very important story. And if you've been around long enough, you know that the other half will come later. First, the scripture. This is from the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 16, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Samuel, "You've mourned long enough for Saul. I have rejected him as king of Israel. So fill your flask with olive oil and go to Bethlehem. Find a man named Jesse who lives there, for I have selected one of his sons to be my king." Once upon a time, a certain man had 3 sons, and he planted a vineyard, and he traveled along the road to Jericho, and he arrived at the sea, and he went on a voyage, this certain man, and found himself in a terrible hurricane that blew the ship totally off course. At points, he was down in between waves, and he looked up at mountains of waves on each side, and the next thing you knew, he was on top of the mountain, then down. Water splashed over the boat. Everybody went down, and only this one man happened to pop up. I should say he washed up on the shore. Woke up on the shore, laying there, with seaweed wrapped around his head, and disoriented and looking around, and he began to notice that pieces of the wrecked ship and items from the wrecked ship were also washing up on the shore. And he knew he was in trouble, though he had no earthly idea he was. It was kind of like Gilligan's Island. They were far from the shipping lanes, and he knew nobody was going to be passing by, not anywhere close enough to visit him. He was worried. He knew he was in trouble. So, like on Gilligan's Island, he had to live on coconut cream pie and papaya daiquiris. That's what he survived on for months and months. And the loneliness of it really started getting to him, but he encountered a few items washed from the boat that gave him at least a little bit of comfort. They made him feel like he still had some connection to the life he had known. For one thing, a broken half of a grandfather clock washed up on the shore, and it didn't tell time except for twice a day. But he built a little hut to protect himself from the monsoons and to store these valuables that kept washing up. The grandfather clock, the half of it propped against the wall. His cell phone was still in his pocket. Of course, you know what happens when cell phones get wet. It didn't work. But just having it, though he couldn't call anybody with it, and though if it had been working, he couldn't have had a signal, he still clung to that cell phone because that reminded him of the life he had had, and it was hard to let go of. And so though it was worthless, he stored it. He found a piece of plastic. He wrapped his cell phone up to keep any further damage from happening. So he got his grandfather clock, he had his cell phone, and guess what else washed up? A hammock to bring him comfort. It was the skipper's hammock, and so it was kind of sunk in the middle, but boy, it gave him a place other than the sand to sleep. And he hung that hammock in his little hut, and it was the one place on the whole island where he felt like he had at least a little bit of control, where he wasn't completely helpless, though it was really just an illusion. It gave him a sense that I'm still, in a way, hanging on to the world I lost, the world I wish I could go back to. My life that's over, I still can't let go of it. A wise man once said, over half of our heartaches go back to one thing, and that is something ended before we wanted it to. You know what I'm talking about? And when something ends before we want it to, I don't know about you, but I naturally hold on to anything that can help me keep that memory alive and stay connected. Well, something similar to that was going on in the life of the prophet Samuel in the Bible story that I began to read just a minute ago. Samuel was the prophet who anointed the very first king of Israel, Saul. Now here's the thing. Samuel never really liked Saul in the first place. Samuel knew in his gut that getting a king at this point, especially this man, was not a good idea. He sensed that this was out of sync with what God was doing. It was out of harmony with God's way, a way that had been working fairly well. But he went ahead and gave in to the wish of the people who demanded a king, anointed Saul king, and Saul got off to a good start, had a few victories, he did some impressive things, but you know, a lot of people are good at getting off to good starts. The starts are always pretty easy for me. It's the finishing that's hard. The starts are strong, but it takes a whole lot of strength to follow all the way through and take what we started with and develop it into something good. Saul just didn't have that. And Samuel is a person who could have developed that in him, who could have taught him how to become a good king, but Saul wouldn't listen. And do you know what it's like to invest your life in somebody? Invest a lot of your time in somebody, invest money in somebody. In the case of a child, for example, or a grandchild, the more you invest of yourself, time, energy, money, they're really all about the same thing. The more you invest of your time, money, energy, of yourself in somebody, the more you care about them and the more you want to see them succeed. What did Jesus say? Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Well, that goes for finances. The more you give to something or somebody. That's one reason you love your kids, because they cost you so much. You spent so much money on them. That's one of the reasons you love them. And we invest in things, and the more we put into them, the more we become part of them, and they're important to us. Samuel had done all of that with King Saul. And so even though King Saul was making a mess of things, even though King Saul himself had become a mess, he was in full-blown self-destruction mode. He was headed downhill in a hurry and making one bad decision after another. After a point, the momentum of the snowball rolling downhill gets so powerful, and it's moving so with such force and so fast that the only thing that's going to stop it is an eventual crash, and that's what Saul was heading for. But Samuel, interestingly, who started out not even really wanting this man as king, finally realized this snowball is about to bust and crash, and it breaks my heart. And he couldn't get over it. And he found himself stuck in trying to salvage something that was already too far gone. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Have you ever tried to salvage something that's already too far gone? To keep something going even after it's crashed and demolished. to try to hold on to the little cell phone that doesn't work and the grandfather clock that's only right twice a day, because there's something about the familiar is at least certain. Let that sink in. What's familiar to us, however miserable it may be, at least it's familiar and it's certain and we know what to expect. If you're married, if you're married to an alcoholic who's abusive, it hurts to keep that husband, but at least you know what to expect. There aren't that many surprises after a while. It gets pretty predictable. And some people, oh my goodness, maybe even most people, when it comes right down to it, prefer the misery, living in the misery of certainty, knowing what to expect, prefer the certainty of misery to the misery we'd have to push through in order to get something different. And so, Saul was not going to get any better. And Samuel was either going to be pulled down with him, there comes that point, or he was going to recognize, hey, I've given my best to this. I'm no quitter. I don't give up easy. But there comes a point where for me to continue propping Saul back up every time he does something irresponsible, self-destructive, that always winds up hurting other people too. Every time I prop him up and I'm really enabling him, because I'm just keeping this cycle going. So it was that the word of the Lord came to Saul, saying, how long will you keep mourning over him? I've got something new in mind. It's time for a change. I want to read that verse again, just after a previous verse that's found in 1 Samuel 15:35. 1 Samuel 15:35. Samuel never went to meet with Saul again, but he mourned constantly for him, and the Lord was sorry he had ever made Saul king over Israel. And pay attention to what that says and also to what it doesn't say. It doesn't say the Lord hated Saul. It doesn't say that the Lord even condemned Saul. But Saul was creating so many problems for himself. And people that continually create problems with themselves and don't do anything about their demons, so to speak, inevitably hurt the people around them, especially the people closest to them. I've been there. I've done that. I know how that works, and some of you may know how that works. And the Lord was sorry he'd ever made this man king. So 16, verse 1, now the Lord said to Samuel, you have mourned long enough for Saul. I've rejected him as king of Israel. So fill your flask with olive oil. Olive oil, the flask of olive oil, the anointing, always is a symbol of the Spirit, which is always about doing something fresh and new. Fill your horn with oil. Go to Bethlehem. Find a man named Jesse who lives there. I've selected one of his sons to be my king. At this point, Samuel had no idea who this somebody was going to be, but there's somebody in Bethlehem, so I will go. Let me say something else about Saul before I go any further. Saul had not always been the wreck that he had become. Early on, He was strong. He was tall. He was brave. He had some very significant insecurity issues, such a low self-esteem that he couldn't even visualize himself as being king, which was probably one of his most fundamental problems, by the way. Anybody who hates themselves is going to have a terribly hard time loving anybody else. Because if you love your neighbor as yourself, boy, if I hate myself and I love Donald the same way I love myself, then Donald's in trouble. Okay? It starts with embracing who you are, not making excuses for who you are, something more like, even though I have done some very irresponsible things, even though I've not been doing my job, even though I've hurt innocent people, I still am loved and I'm still a child of God. Saul couldn't do that. He couldn't do that. And so his life got more and more flimsy and out of control. He makes me think, he and in many situations I've seen in my own life and others, it makes me think of an experience I used to have as a teenager working in my daddy's tire shop. There was this one old farmer who was a cheapskate. He had apparently grown up during the Great Depression, where you just didn't spend money and you had to save and make use of everything you had. And if something tore up or got a hole in it, you couldn't just throw it away and get a new one because there was no money to do it. You had to fix what you had. Well, that's a reminder that there are times in life when a certain way of thinking, a certain way of operating, whether it's smart or not, it's the only way you can operate. You just do the best you can. But the problem is, this was 1989, and this man made a lot of money, but he would not get new tractor tires. And they were as bald as somebody's head I could probably find in here if I looked around, which I would never do, is put somebody on the spot. They were bald. It was bald. And it was always the front two tires. And it took, you know how little it takes to flatten a bald tractor tire when you're bush hogging in a field? I mean, one little briar, not even a thorn, just a briar will do it. And so at least once a week, he'd send his snaggletooth servant in there, bringing that bald tire for me to fix. I must have put 15 or 20 patches on the inside of that bald tire, and I guess it did reinforce that part of it. And then I'd put a patch on the tube. But you talk about a lot of trouble. Another trouble is we only charge $5 to fix flats, and that's whether it was one we could do on the machine in 5 minutes or whether it was this that took an hour. $5. And you know what else? Because this man who could have gotten a new tire he couldn't, so he was still mourning for Saul, you might say. He was still hanging on to that old bald tire that at one time had been good and worked. Because for everything there's a season, but that season was long gone. It was dry rotted around the edge. Not only was he spending a lot, he spent as much money as it would have cost to get him a new one, but he also created terrible trouble for poor little old me. Lesson being, when we refuse to deal with the things in our lives that we really need to let go of and move on, we not only hurt ourselves, we hurt anybody who's connected to us. Even people who are not closely connected, will cause them more trouble than we realize. Saul was like that bald tire. You have any bald tires in your shed? In your house? What about in your head? Do you have any bald tires? I'm talking about attitudes that are no longer working for you. Ways of operating that are causing a lot of trouble and costing you way more than they're worth. I mentioned addiction because I know a little something about morphine addiction. Something that started out at one time as a good thing that was working and relieved pain. But the time came when it was causing way more problems than it was solving. But it was hard to get rid of. It's hard to let go of Saul when you think that's all you've got. Saul wasn't much, but he was all Samuel had. And so the word of the Lord came to Saul, as the word of the Lord comes to you and me, saying, sometimes you got to stop mourning over something that's over. Something that's no longer working. And you just got to trust me that there is something better, but you're not going to find the something better as long as you're still back here trying to patch that old bald tire. We're talking about mentality. You know another one? I want to apply this broadly. Another form of bald tire patching and Saul mourning is hoarding. Hoarding. People that just can't get rid of anything. Raise your hand up high and point to the person closest to you who does that. Here's the thing about hoarding. I come from a family of hoarders. And where at least in our family, I can't speak for, I think that kind of thing got started back in the 30s when there was nothing to hoard. And you held on to every little thing you could get, even an old spool of thread, you could make toys for the kids or something. You wouldn't even throw away a piece of thread, from what I've been told. Eddie Lunsford has told me very plainly what many of you already know. You could take a piece of thread, tie it to the leg of a June bug, and you'd have a remote control helicopter to play with. Till that one ran out of energy, and you throw him down and get another one. Save this stuff. You're going to need it one day. Now, there we go again. At one time, that was fitting, because there were very few items, trinkets. But we live in the manufacturing age where we're flooded with trinkets. We got the exact opposite problem. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying hoarding is some awful, horrible, evil thing, but it does demonstrate an inability to let go. And it grows out of a deep-seated fear that I'm not going to have enough, and so I better hold on to everything I can, including the bald tire, including King Saul, who's only making life terrible for us all. And you know what? Sometimes God and everybody else is waiting for us to have enough. To stop mourning, to recognize this broken clock in my little hut is really just a pretty sick way of trying to hold on to something that's gone anyway. So the man on the beach, he had all these valuables in his hut. It was everything he had. It wasn't much, but he had his clock, he had his phone, he had his hammock for comfort, There's comfort in things that we've held on to, a certain degree of comfort. That's one reason we keep holding. Well, one day, the man went for a walk around the island. After all, he had to get a little exercise. Walked all the way around the other side of the island. He turned and making the complete circle on the way back, and he saw a sight that knocked the wind out of him. He saw a billowing cloud of smoke. Oh no, it can't be that. It can't be that. Maybe, okay, I did have a fire going close to my hut, and he began to run, and he ran, and he tripped, and he fell, and he ran, and he rounded a corner on the beach, and there was his hut containing all he had left of the old life, gone up in flames. It was just smoldering ruins. And you know the first thing he said was, if there's a God, how did he let this happen to me? I mean, that's a very familiar line in case you don't know. How did he let this happen to me? It's all I had. It's all I had. That's the way Saul felt. God, Samuel said, Saul, this is all I got. Chapter 16, verse 2. Samuel asked this command to go and find another king. How can I do that? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me. You know what? Some of the things we cling to, it gets to the point where we're scared to let go of them because it might kill us. They might kill us. If I let anybody know what my spouse is really like, he or she might kill me, or they might leave me. As if that would be a bad thing. Sometimes the reason abuse and neglect and self-destructive behavior continues in a marriage, a family, in an individual, even in a workplace, you know why it continues? Because the person in that position knows that they can. They know they've got a net, and they'll keep doing it. I will keep doing it, I've learned, until I get to the point where I realize, hey, if I do this again, I'm sunk. People will do irresponsible, self-destructive, hurtful things to other people for as long as that works for them. For as long as somebody keeps saying, it's all right, it's all right, it's all right. You know, there's a fine line between totally loving and accepting a person for who they are, which is a Jesus concept for sure. But on the other side of that fine line is an equal and obvious truth. And that is, it's actually not loving to continue going along with something that is destroying the person we love and hurting us and other people. That goes for, and I've been talking a lot as if we're talking about things outside us. I touched on a few, hoarding, that are within us, attitudes that are within us. Even people who have this old grievance that they can't let go of, even though it happened a long time ago, and in their mind, to watch the way their mind works, you'd think it happened day before yesterday. And we don't realize that if you've ever been betrayed, you know what it's like to be betrayed. I heard one of the smartest psychologists I know say recently that the experience of being betrayed has a worse neurological effect in the brain than any other known emotion. It does a permanent damage. That's true with betrayal. What's also true is that, let me put it this way, betrayal is usually somebody did not turn out to do or be what we expected, or somebody failed us in a way we were counting on them to succeed and help us. It is very true that you and I have been betrayed by other people in that way. You know what's also true? Those other people have been betrayed by you and me. It is very true that life will not always go the way you expected. Your job will not always go the way you expected. Your marriage, your children will not always turn out as beautifully as you were counting on. But in the same way, those people at your job have discovered that you didn't turn out to be all they expected and hoped for. And neither did your children, and neither did your spouse. Until we realize we're all in this together, and the only real choice is, will I keep mourning over Saul, or will I arise, fill my horn with oil, and go to Bethlehem and find something fresh, something new? It was risky to do, but he did it. Samuel did it. Chapter 16, verse 6 through 7. When they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab. Eliab was the tallest of Jesse's sons, and he immediately thought, he had it pegged, surely this is the Lord's anointed. I mean, this is who I would pick, so surely that's who God wants. Isn't that the way you think and pray? I know I do. I have to make sure and tell God how it needs to be and who he needs to work on and who he needs to tap on the shoulder and why he needs to do it, because it's just so obvious. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I've rejected him. Oh, and get this part. Talk about, the Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. What? How could he not? The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. The Lord looks at people's heart. The Lord also looks at the heart of the matter at hand. And he sees things about the matters of your life and mine that we don't see. And the sooner we stop telling him what he needs to do, the sooner we can surrender and open up our eyes to what he might actually be doing. Samuel was confused. By the way, it can be confusing when your hut's been burned and you've thrown away the old ball tire, but you don't have another tire or another hut, and you don't know what to do or where to go. Samuel got confused. Verse 10 through 12 of that chapter. In the same way, all 7 of Jesse's sons were presented to Samuel, but Samuel said unto Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. Then Samuel said what I'd have said. Are these all the sons you have? Because I could have sworn the Lord told me that I was going to find a new king here. Well, there is a youngest, Jesse replied, but he's out in the field watching the sheep and the goats. I mean, he's the one we didn't even bother bringing up to the house. Samuel said, we will not sit down to eat till he arrives. So Jesse sent for him. He was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes, and the Lord said, this is the one, anoint him. And this boy was King David. And a chapter later, he slew a giant. And a decade later, he was the greatest king the Hebrew people ever knew. So great that even when Jesus was on the earth in his ministry, 1,500 years later, they called him Son of David, Son of David, Son of David. But David was not easily found. So like, what I mean by that when I say David was not easily found, when you let go of the life that you thought you couldn't live without, and you move out in search of what's waiting for you, you will inevitably pass through a period of confusion. That's what they call the hallway, liminal space. You know, you've let the one door, you've heard me say this before, the old door shut behind you and locked, and you're in the hallway. Samuel's out in the hallway. Are these all your sons? Because I've come a long way. There will be that period of confusion, and that's what you have to push on through. But if you want a fresh start, if you want a new tire, don't keep settling for patching one that needs to be discarded. I remember one time, 20 years ago, I preached a sermon on this passage, and I didn't say the same things, but I apparently said enough of the same kind of thing that afterwards a woman came up to me and she said, "Lance, you know what? That sermon you just preached, somebody who didn't know any better might interpret that they need to get a divorce." And I thought about that. And I've watched that for 20 years. And I got to be careful how I say this, because some people would use this as an excuse. But the truth is, there are some people who should have gotten a divorce because they should have never married in the first place. It's like when Israel chose Saul as their king, they were out of God's will. And when you're out of harmony with God, don't make big decisions, because they're likely to be the wrong ones. Some of those can be resolved. But there are times when they can't. There's a time for everything, the Bible says. Be careful with that, but also know that. Actually, I come to think of it, somebody comes to talk to me about their marriage, I can assure you I don't start out by saying, just get a divorce. No. But there are those people who are married to Saul or to Sauline. And it's been years and nothing's changing, and children are being taught a terrible way of living, and permanent damage is being done. And there comes time to stop mourning, make a fresh start. And sometimes things have to get so bad that we lose the things we thought we couldn't live without, because until we lose the things we thought we couldn't lose without, we're really never going to step out into the life that's waiting for us. Now, back to our boy on the island who rounded the bend, his hut gone up in flames, his cell phone that didn't work was now melted. His grandfather clock that was only right twice a day now was not right at all because the hands melted off. His hammock was the first thing to burn up. And he just went to his knees. Oh, God, where are you? Why have you forsaken me? How could you let this happen to me? And he lay there in the dust, in the sand, just pounding the earth and screaming. The one thing he had hold of, the one connection he had to his old life, had gone up in flames. And as he lay there, after about an hour, he heard something go, honk, honk. And then it got louder. Honk, honk. He looked, and here come a freight liner. It stopped out in the deep water, and a small rowboat started making its way toward the shore. He could hardly believe what was happening. And he said to his rescuers, I can't believe this. I'm not in the shipping lanes. How on earth, in all of that ocean, how did you find me? And the captain said, oh, it was very simple. We saw your signal fire. Sometime, one way or another, something has to burn that can be the very signal fire that takes us from where we no longer need to be into the life that is waiting. Remember that next time your hut burns